When is it enough? 15 is not enough. Our lives are messy, complicated things. Our histories even more so. When we consider our stories, we collect them as evidence that we were here. We gather the ideas, the insights, the conflicts, and pour our hearts into diaries and journals. We summon the pain and the creativity to document our lives in articles and essays. We collate and commemorate the dates while penning the stories in books and poems. We capture the rawness and the exhilaration when composing the melodies and scribbling the lyrics. We tape visually and auditorily the anguish and the hope when we try to stop the world for one moment to hold on to, one instance to grasp. And then we light our candles and we share. When a concern weighs heavily or joy demands exposure. When immersed in an MLIS world, Masters of Library and Information Science, each of those pieces of information is referred to as a record. Whether it's a treatise or a document, a video or a web page, a social media post, or an entire shelf of encyclopedias. They're all records, and they are all there to fill a need. So that might sound odd to someone not in or pursuing this profession, because when most of us think of the word need, we think of food, water, shelter. Perhaps we consider warmth in winter, and definitely here, air conditioning in summer. And often, gently, we remind people that acceptance, nurturing, education, equality, equity, justice, and love are also needs, as they sometimes deteriorate. So how is a record a need? How can information be a necessity and not a want or an ask? Simple. How is that food, water, or shelter going to be acquired? Where can one go to be properly trained, to be able to afford that warmth or air conditioning? What parts of a city, a county, a state or province, or a nation are ensuring that acceptance and nurturing are occurring at all phases of life? Who is blazing the path for equality, equity, and justice? Are there any tales of those who've already trod these roads and who blazed forth first? And what advice can they lend to support the adventure of following a new need, a new desire, a different wish to be fulfilled? Outside any major city, you can find a highway or interstate that bypasses the main portion of that city to take you around and beyond it. If it is not your destination, you don't learn about it as the starting point of those cities. You miss its nooks and crannies, the quirks and idiosyncrasies, the twists and turns that led it to spreading out and constructing new points. Now, it's not that they don't exist. It's just that you went around it because it wasn't important. When we look at women's history, the books and the standards, it's like we were bypassed. We were not a destination worthy of recording unless we did something exceptional and extraordinary. Our nooks and crannies, our quirks and idiosyncrasies, our twists and turns didn't cease to exist. They just haven't been treated as a starting point for the heart of the story of what it means to be human. I say we because I'm a cisgender woman and I was assigned this gender at birth because of my genitalia. And I was raised in a time that saw things like haircuts and clothing as binary. And when my hair was short, I was mistaken many a time for a boy. And then I grew into a body that changed and altered. And when it did, when people looked at the outer portions of it, well, they didn't make that mistake again because society had deemed what those looks meant. But other mistakes, however, did occur based on my perceived gender. Like many young people that present as female, I had to prove that I was smart. And I had to prove I was capable. And I felt this urge based on all of the amazing, ordinary, and extraordinary women that I knew, to make sure that my voice and the voices of others who are marginalized were not silenced. And unfortunately, I learned, based on the perception of my gender, that being wary and alert is not optional, because I had to know how to protect myself, or at least minimize the harm in the case of assault or abuse. I am glad to say that I no longer live in a time or space where people are happy that we are divided along these lines. We now live in a time when a pronoun can help guide the way to telling the beginnings, and just the beginning, of a person's story and their identity. Because as Simona Giordano, Director of Medical Ethics at Manchester University Medical School, stated in Understanding Gender, even the biological categories of male and female are moving. We know today that not just the X and Y chromosome, that at least 12 others across the human genome have no sex differentiation. And at least 30 genes are involved in sex development. Let that wave wash away the preconceived idea of gender. So, I thank the heavens for their assistance. And I'm glad to say that there's more to the story than what you can be assigned at birth. This Women's History Service is for all of us who know someone who does identify as a woman, or did, and especially those women that were bypassed. Because we're now fortunate enough to have people looking for and sharing their stories. In 1978, when I was 12, I'll do the math for you, I'm 57. The first Women's History Week was observed with speeches, parades, activities, and learning centers all across Sonoma County, right here in California. The educators behind this push for opening a history people left out were inspired by International Women's Day, which was first celebrated in 1908 by the Socialist Party in New York because of the women who were striving and striking for better working conditions in the garment industry. From 1910 to 1917, women around the world created their own versions of that day, recognizing the contributions of women, and it was officially finally recognized as International Day of Commemoration by the United Nations in 1977. Molly McGregor of the Women's History Alliance organization, a nonprofit that sprang out of that first Women's History Week, shared that success in Sonoma at St. Lawrence College, and she inspired others to rally and advocate for National Week of Learning, which then Still unfortunately to be late, President Jimmy Carter signed as a presidential proclamation in 1980. Then Representative and later Senator Barbara Mikulski and Senator Orrin Hatch led a bipartisan coalition to have Women's History Week annually in the U.S. Now, you cannot get further apart on a political spectrum of actual elected officials in the U.S. as Mikulski and Hatch. Mikulski here, probably sitting in our sanctuary. Hatch probably protesting on the outside of our church. But they both knew that this was a good idea. By 1986, 14 of the U.S. states had expanded it to a full month. And from 87 on, every president since has put pen to paper to recognize March as Women's History Month in the United States. But the gap between Mikulski and Hatch pales in comparison with the gender gap across the world. The World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report of 2022 examined countries in 4 areas: for foreign needs, for women to succeed if the gender gap is closed. They were economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political attainment. That not one woman has signed that presidential proclamation in the U.S. explains why our ranking in political attainment is 38 out of 146 countries. We are 27th in the world in closing all 4 gaps. We're 22nd in economic opportunities, 51st in educational attainment, and 83rd in health and survival. If it's any consolation, Iceland, with the best gender parity of all nations on the planet, ranks worse than us in health and survival. Perhaps that's why last year's theme for Women's History Month was healers, and it wasn't just the impact of the pandemic, but the fact that this so-called greatest nation on earth and on this planet with so much medical knowledge and technology, we are less likely to be healthy and less likely to survive if we are female. My students last year learned and shared information about healers in honor of last year's theme. From ancienthistory.net, and I quote, "Throughout history, women have always been healers. They were pharmacists, cultivating herbs and exchanging the secrets of their uses. They were also nurses, counselors, midwives, who traveled from home to home and village to village. The history of women in medicine dates back to 3,500 BCE. Queen Puabi of Ur was buried with surgical instruments so that she might practice surgery in the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, priestesses of Isis were regarded as physician healers who obtained their healing powers from the goddess Isis herself. Egyptian records show that women studied at the Royal Medical School at Heliopolis as early as 1500 BCE. And yet, while women have made inroads in educational attainment at the college level, and yes, even with medical degrees, they're still shunted primarily to taking care of children and other women. The students also learned from a mighty girl about Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, who, when she lost her brother and father to typhoid fever, knew that she was going to be a doctor. So she graduated in 1898, one of the few people who were women doctors at that time, and no one wanted her in private practice. So she took a job in public health, working in Hell's Kitchen, one of New York's public's worst and poorest neighborhoods. And she realized that by improving the health of children, she could improve the health of an entire community. So Dr. Joe assigned visiting nurses to new mothers designed safer infant clothing that we still use to this day, set up milk stations and created training and licensing for midwives, and her work saved over 90,000 children. You can read more about her life in a children's book, Dr. Joe, How Sarah Josephine Baker Saved the Lives of America's Children, by Monica Cohen. Or maybe you could turn to Studies Weekly and learn about Margaret Chung, who was born the same year Dr. Baker became a medical practitioner in 1889 and died in 1959. In 1916, Margaret Chung graduated from the University of Southern California Medical School, becoming the first American-born Chinese female doctor in the U.S. She was a devout Christian, and she applied to be a medical missionary, but she was rejected because of her race, according to Annie Wilson's March 2021 article for Columbia Medical Association. But she was determined to work as a doctor. So Chung completed her residency in Chicago, and then she moved to Los Angeles, and she actually became a well-known surgeon among Hollywood celebrities. During World War II, Chung volunteered to serve as a surgeon, but instead, because of her age, the government asked her to recruit pilots for a unit that became known as the Flying Tigers. These pilots became like her sons. Throughout the war, she sent them letters and Christmas gifts to keep them in good spirits. Using her connections with celebrities and politicians, Chung lobbied for the formation of the U.S. Naval Women's Reserve, known as the Waves. But unfortunately, she was not allowed to join the Waves herself due to her age, her race, and her suspected affiliation with the LGBTQ plus movement, according to the Legacy Project. Intersectionality was a thing before we had the term. Chung died of cancer in 1959 at the age of 69. So they learned about others too, not just medical practitioners, but women like Dr. Shirley Jackson, the first American physicist to receive a PhD from MIT in '73. And they learned about the 688, the Women's Postal Directory Battalion, but don't worry, Reverend Matt, a Netflix special is coming. So other people will know beyond the 3 minutes on CNN 10 that's curated for children. They learned about how the first home security system was invented by Mary Van Bitten in that same year that I was born and announced a female. And in the record, which at the time was the Stockton record, I was born to my father. My mother's name was not part of the record. In 57 years, a few things have changed. Not enough. So why are random facts and abridged versions of these women's stories even important? Well, how many of you have heard of them? I'm guessing maybe a couple, but probably most not. How about Abigail Adams, Jane Addams, Susan B. Anthony, Anne Hutchinson, Norma McCorvey, better known as Jane Roe, Rosa Parks, Eleanor Roosevelt, Sacagawea, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Mercy Otis Warren, I.G. Wells Barnett, or Phyllis Wheatley? I saw a few heads nod yes. Well, you fit right in a K-12 history classroom in 2023, because those 15 women out of 178 women or groups of women mentioned by name are part of the U.S. history standards across all 50 states and Washington, D.C. There are a total of 1,975 groups or women included in the standards, but only those 15 are mentioned in more than 10 states. 15. 15 women out of every woman that has trod on this soil. That's it. That's all we're good for in the history books in 2023. Well, no wonder we only have a third of the entire Congress, and that's considered our biggest dent yet. So let's bring it closer to home. Do you know Dr. Hazel Hill, or Bucky Leyland, Alma DeRico, or Helen Danner? How about Dolores Huerta, Elizabeth Humbarger, June Ferguson, or Tilly Lewis? They're all women who made an impact on the history of San Joaquin County, and they have spaces named after them at Delta College. The radio and television department of Delta researched all of those women's history in 2019, and they put together videos which are super short, most are less than a minute. But at least you get the insight on why these women were honored by having buildings named after them. You can still access these videos and podcasts and other women's history facts on the KWDC webpage or the YouTube for San Joaquin Delta College. And Delta and UOP are doing a ton of stuff this month in honor of Women's History Month. So kudos to the young people for bringing forth the names. Our late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was famously quoted as saying, "So now, the perception is yes, women are here to stay. And when I'm sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And I say, well, when there are 9, people are shocked. But there have been 9 men, and nobody's ever raised a question about that. So no, 15 is not enough. We need to tell these women's stories because they should not be bypassed. We need to be better than when Myra Pollock-Sacker, author of Research opined. Each time a girl opens a book and finds a womanless history, she learns she is worth less. So the theme for this year's Women's History Month is the stories and storytellers of our lives. My own mother is a naturally gifted storyteller, and she shared the love of passing on people's records. Her stories always inspired me, and I want you to leave with at least an uplifting story. So here's the story of Bridget B. Mason. Bridget B. Mason was a midwife, nurse, philanthropist, and real estate mogul in the early years of California history. Ms. Mason was born into slavery in 1818, Mississippi. She had no last name. She was sold multiple times throughout Georgia and South Carolina. And her last slaveholder from Mississippi forced her to follow him and his family to help found Salt Lake City. She walked the entire trip of 1,700 miles to Utah, had to break and set up camp, all while tending her slave owners' children as well as her own, ages 10, 4, and newborn. Then in 1851, the Smith family moved again and forced Biddy to walk to the state of California. Well, of course, California's a free state. And when the Smiths tried to take her out of the state to Texas, a slave-holding state, friends that Biddy had made while here alerted the authorities. Biddy and members of her family were taken into protective custody under writ of habeas corpus, and she set out to petition for her freedom. Now, it is worthy of a movie filmed in LA, as they were stopped at the Cajon Pass by the sheriff and his posse and the deputies riding on horseback to keep them from getting out of this parameters of California. So she sued the Smith family for treating her as a slave under the laws of California, which did not allow for this injustice. But she couldn't testify against them because she was Black. But the judge wasn't stupid. The judge got around that stupid racist rule about Black people not being able to testify in court. by having her come and testify in his chambers, because there was no law about that. And she won her case. She got to choose her own last name. She got to choose her identity. And she settled with her now 3 daughters, an extended family in what is now the San Bernardino area. They later moved to Los Angeles, where she worked as a midwife and a nurse. She worked so diligently that she saved her money to buy land, and she invested in what is now the heart of downtown Los Angeles. She amassed a fortune of $300,000, which now is about $9.5 million, just in acquiring land. But she didn't keep it. She didn't use it for generational wealth. She used it for the people. She was instrumental in organizing and co-founding the first African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the first, oldest, and still existing African American church in LA. She opened a daycare center for Black children that was so well attended, children of all races and ethnicities attended. She was known as Aunt Biddy and Grandma Mason because she donated so much money as a philanthropist to so many different causes that helped the Angelinos of all races, all ethnicities, all gender identities, all sexuality. She didn't stop. She gave and she gave and she gave. She is now prominently displayed in the center of murals that were created in created in the 30s, finished in 1938 by Polish artist Bernard Zakheim as part of the WPC. And it used to be a big, massive set of panels. And she was smack dab in the middle with her brown face as a healer, not as a patient, not as an assistant, not as a cook, not as a servant, not as a slave. UCSF was worried about those murals, and last year they took her down, having them in a special climate-controlled storage area, and are looking for a new space in which to design and showcase the early healers, including Ms. Mason. She has a park in Spring Street. The U.S. National Park Services has a webpage dedicated solely to her, and maybe, just maybe, she'll get her own Netflix special. Right before walking up here today, I was asked if I chose the first song that the choir was singing, and I had to answer yes. I chose all the hymns and the readings with one exception. They are all composed or primarily written by women. The one exception, anonymous. Now, isn't that the saying on the bumper sticker for those of us before the internet and on memes now that we have an internet? That anonymous was a woman. So I task you today that she stops being anonymous. Lift up your voice, gather the stories of yourself or the women you have loved. Share those tales widely, for you are shaped by those with whom you surround yourself. You are the power. You are your ancestors' dream fulfilled. And when you share those stories loud and wide, women, men, children, people of no binary gender identity, people of all identities, don't get lost, they don't get forgotten, and their stories don't wash away with the rain. Thank you.